Imagine, just for a second, taking your child to a developmental specialist.
Okay, yeah.
You're sitting in this very clinical, brightly lit room, and the professional across the desk looks at you and says that because your child learned to sing an entire song to communicate a feeling.
Right, like an entire song.
Exactly, an entire song before they ever learn to say the single word apple, well, there's something fundamentally broken, like the child just isn't functioning correctly.
That's awful.
It is. And today, we are looking at why our massive institutional frameworks are fundamentally, terrified of minds that arrive whole.
Because it is a profound structural conflict,
Right.
honestly. I mean, we assume our systems, education, behavioral therapy, standardized testing, we just assume they're designed to truly understand human minds.
Right. That's the promise, anyway.
Exactly. But when you look closely at the architecture of these systems, understanding is totally secondary. They are built for categorization.
Sort and file.
Yep. And the moment a mind walks through the door that cannot be easily categorized, the system doesn't just fail to help that individual. It actively marginalizes them.
Which is the exact mission of our deep dive today. We are exploring this fascinating, just beautifully written excerpt from a Substack post by Dr. Jaime Hoerricks.
It's such a good piece.
It really is. The piece is titled Episode 554, Priced Out of Personhood, the Minds It Cannot Invoice. And we are going to unpack the specific tension outlined in this text, like why a market built entirely on sorting isolated parts fundamentally struggles with human beings who process the world as a complete, unified whole.
Well, the title alone, priced out of personhood, it immediately establishes the stakes.
Yes, the heavy title.
We're looking at what happens when a specific type of cognitive processing, which is known as Gestalt processing, collides with rigid institutional measurement. It's basically the friction between a holistic human experience and a bureaucracy that, well, it can only function by breaking things down into isolated billable pieces.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to understand the minds our systems struggle with, we really have to establish exactly what kind of minds the market actually prefers.
Right.
And the text lays this out so clearly. Dr. Hoerricks points out that the market understands certain minds almost immediately. But here's the kicker. It is not because the market possesses some deep empathy or true comprehension of that individual.
No, not at all.
Right. It is strictly because it knows how to sort them.
Because sorting is a administrative function.
Yes.
Understanding is a human one.
Exactly.
The market, as it's described in the source, it relies on identifying very specific, isolated deficits.
Yeah.
It looks for a missing skill. It points to a measurable delay.
Right. It wants to find the broken piece.
Yes. It searches for a target behavior, or like a clear next step. It is entirely predicated on finding a gap that it can theoretically step in and fill.
See, that immediately makes me think of taking a car to the mechanic.
Oh, that's a good comparison.
Right. Like when my car starts making this rattling sound, the mechanic doesn't sit me down to discuss the entire history of the vehicle as a unified entity.
No, they definitely don't.
No, they plug a diagnostic machine into the dashboard to isolate the broken part. The machine spits out a code, and they say, hey, you have a misfiring spark plug. The complex machine is treated as nothing more than a collection of separate components.
Just a bunch of parts.
Exactly. You isolate the bad part, diagnose it, and fix it in a totally linear sequence. And according to the text, this is exactly what our systems do to a child. The child is literally broken into parts, and once those parts are named, the machinery begins to move.
And what's fascinating here is, if you push that analogy further, think about what happens after the mechanic identifies that spark plug.
They bill you.
Exactly. They write up a work order. They bill you for the specific labor of removing the old plug and the cost of the new one. The repair shop thrives on that modularity.
Wow, yeah.
If an institution can break a human being into distinct modular parts, it can process them efficiently. Goals are written down, interventions are chosen, and progress is tracked on a spreadsheet.
I hear you on the assembly line analogy, and it sounds very cold when we put it that way, but let me play devil's advocate for just a second here.
Sure.
Aren't these measurements kind of necessary? If you're running a massive public school system or a statewide early intervention program, how else are you supposed to track whether a kid is actually learning or, getting the support they need without breaking it down into measurable steps?
Well, it's a completely fair question, and honestly, it's exactly why these systems were built this way in the first place. Logistically, a bureaucracy needs data.
Right.
The problem arises when the map replaces the territory, when the administrative need to measure a step becomes more important than the actual development of the child.
Oh,
Yeah, the institution's output becomes streamlined, sure, but it forces every single human being through an assembly line model
hmm.
because it is inherently trackable. And crucially, and this gets back to the title, a trackable part is a part that can be invoiced. You can bill an insurance company for, quote, working on eye contact for 30 minutes. You cannot easily bill for nurturing a complex, unified consciousness.
Wow. Which brings us to a line in the excerpt that just, it stopped me in my tracks. Dr. Hoerricks writes, hope becomes a graph.
It is such a devastating distillation of the institutional mindset.
It really is.
Because hope, in its natural human state, is expansive, right?
Right,
It's
exactly.
qualitative and messy. But inside this machinery, hope is reduced to a quantitative metric. It is flattened onto an X and Y axis.
Literally just a line on a page.
Exactly. You are charting the incremental upward trajectory of a target behavior over time. If the line on the graph goes up, the intervention is deemed successful, the parents are told to feel hopeful, and the institution feels validated.
The system essentially demands that human development look like a rising stock portfolio.
Yep.
And I imagine it is incredibly comforting for the people running the machinery. A graph gives you this illusion of control. You sit in an individualized education program meeting, point to the jagged line going up and say, look, progress. But you aren't necessarily measuring the flourishing of the human being.
No, you're not.
You are measuring the repair of an isolated part.
And this mechanical approach hums along smoothly. Well, at least from the institution's perspective. As long as the individual being processed conforms to being disassembled.
Right.
As long as their mind accepts being broken down into a missing skill or a measurable delay, the system works.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because if the system only sees value in a straight, measurable line, what happens to a brain that fundamentally refuses to be taken apart?
That is the big question.
Right. The core tension of Dr. Hoerricks' piece is that not all minds will allow themselves to be disassembled. The text introduces us to minds that arrive whole. And this is the concept of Gestalt processing.
Which is, frankly, structurally inconvenient for these systems.
Highly inconvenient.
The text describes these minds as ones that, quote, gather before they separate. They hold the whole before they name the part.
We should probably ground this, because gathering before separating sounds very poetic, but what does it actually look like in the real world? For a listener who might not be familiar with cognitive science, give us an ELI 5, explain it like a 5 example of Gestalt processing in action.
Okay, let's look at language development, which is where this tension usually first appears.
Perfect.
The traditional institutional expectation is analytical learning. Think of it like building blocks. A child learns individual sounds, then puts them together to form a word like water.
Okay.
Then they learn a verb like want. Eventually, they stack the blocks. Want water. That is a linear part-to-whole process. And the system loves this because it can track every single block.
Right. Step 1, step 2, step.
Exactly. But a Gestalt language processor works top-down. They learn the melody, the intonation, and the entire phrase is one giant chunk of meaning before they ever understand the individual words inside it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. For example, a child might memorize an entire scene from a movie. Let's say every time they are thirsty, they quote a specific 10-second line from Toy Story.
Okay.
To them, that entire auditory block means I am thirsty. They don't actually know the word thirsty. They just know that the entire audio clip conveys the feeling they are experiencing in that moment.
That's amazing.
It is, and only much, much later do they begin to break that giant chunk down into individual flexible words.
It's like downloading a massive zip file from the internet.
Yes, exactly.
You have the entire file, like a whole package of meaning, downloaded directly to your hard drive, but you can't access the individual Word documents and photos inside it until the whole thing is fully unzipped and extracted later on.
That is a perfect way to visualize it.
But if you're interacting with a system that only communicates via fax machine, demanding one piece of paper at a time, the institution is going to get incredibly frustrated.
Oh, totally.
The institution is standing there shouting, just fax me the paper that says Apple. And the Gestalt mind is saying, I just handed you the entire zip file of a Pixar movie that perfectly encapsulates the emotional resonance of hunger. Why are you upset?
And this is where we have to look closely at the specific verbs Dr. Hoerricks uses to describe the unique developmental rhythm of these Gestalt minds.
Yeah, the language is so specific here.
It really is. The text says, these minds return, circle, store, echo, and ripen. Think about the stark contrast between those words and the language of the market.
Right.
The market wants a clear next step. That is a straight line forward. But return, circle, echo, these are cyclical verbs. They describe a process that spirals and iterates.
And ripen is such a profoundly biological word. I mean, you can't put a tomato on an assembly line and command it to ripen by next Tuesday at 3:00 p.m. so you can hit a quarterly metric.
No, you really can't.
It requires an environment, time, and its own internal natural rhythm.
And when a Gestalt mind processes information by storing it, echoing it, and circling back to it, it is integrating knowledge into a massive, unified web. It makes perfect sense from the inside.
Yeah.
But to a system built to track forward momentum on a graph, it looks like a failure. The system does not have an administrative code for ripening.
Let's bring in another analogy to really cement how the system evaluates this. Because if a system is obsessed with finding an isolated target behavior, how does an evaluator actually perceive a child who is busy holding the whole?
Right. How does that look on paper?
Exactly. To me, it's like a bureaucratic system trying to evaluate a magnificent painting like, say, Van Gogh's Starry Night by strictly measuring the length and thickness of the individual brushstrokes.
But to take that further, the person with the ruler isn't just missing the beauty of the Starry Night. They are actively writing a clinical report saying the canvas is defective because the blue paint doesn't conform to standard dimensions.
No.
They are so fixated on isolating the part that they are completely blind to the whole. And for the child, they're experiencing the brilliance of the Starry Night. But the system is penalizing them for not producing the correct, standardized brushstrokes in the correct sequential order.
It just makes you realize how utterly absurd the framework is when applied to organic human growth.
It really does.
The institution is asking, did you take step 3 today? And the Gestalt mind is essentially saying, I am currently echoing step 1 while storing the concept of step 5, so the entire structure can ripen simultaneously.
Which raises an urgent question about the design of our institutions, right? If a mind naturally gathers the whole before naming the part, and the institution strictly demands the part before acknowledging the whole, the two are fundamentally, structurally at odds.
Completely incompatible.
Yes. The institution's entire infrastructure, its standardized tests, its funding models, its diagnostic criteria, its intervention strategies, is all built on the assumption of linearity. When faced with the Gestalt processing, the system's tools are rendered entirely useless.
So what does this all mean for the human being caught in this friction? I mean, if you are listening to this and wondering how this abstract conflict plays out in the real world, the consequences are incredibly harsh.
Very harsh.
The source points out that institutions prefer what it calls a neat little staircase of development.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the neat little staircase is the ultimate manifestation of the parts-based market. Step 1, Step 2, Step 3. It is clear, measurable, and easily invoiced.
But because Gestalt minds refuse this staircase, because they are busy circling and ripening instead of climbing step by step, they get hit with deeply negative institutional labels. Dr. Hoerricks notes that these minds are frequently called confusing and inconsistent in clinical and educational settings. And this is where the real tragedy of the text reveals itself.
The tragedy is that those labels are entirely misplaced.
Totally.
The text explicitly states that the way these minds return, circle, and ripen makes perfect sense from inside themselves. They are not confused at all. They are operating on a highly complex, deeply logical internal rhythm.
So when the institution calls them confusing, it is nothing more than a projection. The system is projecting its own failure to measure the child onto the child. The institution is the one that is confused.
And the system does not tolerate its own confusion well,
No, it really doesn't.
Which brings us back to the literal mechanism behind the title.
Yeah.
Priced out of personhood. We need to talk about what it administratively means to be priced out.
Yes, let's trace the money here. How does a child's natural cognitive process literally prevent an invoice from being generated?
It all comes down to billing codes and funding models. Imagine a behavioral therapy clinic or like a special education department seeking state funding.
Okay.
To get paid, they cannot submit a vague claim that says, hey, we're providing a safe environment for the child to ripen.
Right, they'd laugh you out of the office.
An insurance company will reject that instantly. They require a specific diagnostic code tied to a measurable deficit. The paperwork must say something like, the client exhibits a 40% delay in expressive vocabulary. The intervention will target the acquisition of 50 new individual words over 6 months.
Wow. So the funding itself is entirely tethered to the parts.
Completely. The clinic must prove that they took a broken part, applied a specific intervention, and tracked the upward trend on a graph.
Hope becomes a graph again.
Exactly. When a Gestalt mind arrives and their development looks like a spiral instead of a staircase, the clinic cannot measure a clean cap. If they can't measure the gap, they can't assign an administrative billing code. And if they can't assign the code, the clinic doesn't get paid.
Oh, wow. So the price of personhood is literal. Like, it's an economic reality. When a mind arrives whole and refuses to be broken down into billable parts, it becomes a financial liability to the system.
That is the crux of the issue right there. To be priced out of personhood suggests that in this market-driven framework, your very status as a recognized, valued person is contingent on your ability to be processed by the machinery.
That's terrifying.
It is. The system demands you be broken into parts so it can justify its existence and generate its invoices. If you cannot be invoiced, the system subtly begins to deny your full personhood. It reduces you to a problem that cannot be solved, rather than a whole human being that simply operates on a different holistic frequency.
It is literally penalized for its own completeness. And, if you're listening to this and thinking, well, maybe this is just a niche issue in special education, we really need to look in the mirror because that staircase mentality is everywhere.
Oh, absolutely everywhere.
We apply it to everything. Think about corporate performance reviews. Think about how we evaluate our peers. We expect human beings to be these predictable, linear machines moving neatly from one milestone to the next.
And the cost of that expectation is immense.
Yeah.
We are effectively punishing cognitive diversity because our administrative ledgers aren't designed to handle it.
Right.
We are choosing the convenience of the graph over the reality of the human mind. And in doing so, we are losing the profound contributions of people who can see the entire starry night while the rest of us are arguing over the length of the brushstrokes.
Wow. We've covered a lot of deep conceptual ground here. Let's pull all these threads together.
Sounds good.
For you listening right now, the core takeaway from Dr. Hoerricks' text is the stark difference between two opposing worldviews. On one side, you have a market-driven bureaucracy that insists on breaking a human down into isolated parts, missing skills, measurable delays, broken spark plugs, just so it can assign a billing code and turn hope into a graph.
And on the other side, you have the beautiful reality of Gestalt processing, right? Minds that arrive whole. Minds that naturally gather the zip file before unpacking the documents. Minds that return, circle, store, echo, and ripen on their own organic timelines.
And because these whole minds refuse to walk up the institution's neat little staircase, the system projects its own failure onto them, labeling them confusing and inconsistent. They are quite literally priced out of personhood because their natural developmental rhythm cannot be easily invoiced.
Which is just so backwards.
It is. And it's a powerful reminder to examine the frameworks in our own lives. Like, how often do you evaluate yourself, your children, or your colleagues based on these rigid institutional staircases? How often do we demand linear progress when we should be allowing for a natural, cyclical ripening?
It really challenges us to fundamentally shift our perspective. Instead of demanding that a human being comply with the administrative limitations of a system, we must ask how to build environments that honor and foster the whole person exactly as they are.
Which leaves us with one final provocative thought for you to mull over. We opened by asking you to imagine taking your child to a system that categorizes minds like a mechanic looking for a broken part. If our current societal structures, our funding models, and our institutions are entirely built to invoice the parts,
What entirely new systems would we have to build to actually value, nurture, and celebrate a mind that arrives whole?